My name is Paul Levinson, and I thought it would be refreshing to mention that I'm not a past president of NISCA. In fact, I've barely attended NISCA conferences. Um, in fact, one of the few conferences that I attended was back maybe in 1997 or 1998 when Lance talked me into coming up here and presenting a paper about something. Um, and my daughter Molly, who was then about 10 or 11 years old, um, thought it would be nice to come up and see the famous Catskills. This was held in Kutcher's. So I brought her along, and I'm sure Molly enjoyed my presentation and enjoyed meeting many people. But all she talked about on the way home was the 5-minute conversation she had had with Neil. Um, and that made such an impression on her that when I told her that Neil had died, she actually, had tears in her eyes and said he was one of the nicest people I had ever talked to. And that was, over 5 years ago. I have lots of memories of Neil. He was my doctoral teacher at NYU from 1976 to 1979. I tried during that period of time to teach him the correct way to think about media. I thought he was far too pessimistic, but I failed utterly. Nonetheless, I think Neil did teach me how to teach. And so after the celebration in September, about a week after that, I got the page proofs to my next book on the cell phone, and I dedicated that book to Neil. And the dedication reads, "To Neil Postman, who taught me how to teach." And so I was glad to hear Lance say the same about how he felt about Neil, because I think that that was the most extraordinary thing about Neil among his many extraordinary gifts. One other thing about Neil, which was extraordinary for me in a personal way, goes back to sometime in the late 1970s when I went up to see Neil in his office in Shimkin Hall. Those of us who were Neil's students know what I'm talking about. Neil sat behind that desk. He held court there, talking about all kinds of things. Usually he was pretty chipper, but on this day when I went in to see him in his office, and I can't remember even what I was going in to see him about, Neil was poring over a manuscript, sort of wringing, his hands. Paul, he said to me, I can't make any sense of this. So I said, well, let me take a look at it. After all, I was, especially in those days, always glad to be the helpful student. And he gave me the manuscript, and I noticed something right away on the title page. It said H. Marshall McLuhan. And below that it said The Laws of the Media. And I said to Neil, well, this is a manuscript by Marshall McLuhan, which obviously he knew. And he said, yeah, I know, but I can't make much sense out of it. Which is not surprising, given Marshall McLuhan. A lot of people had trouble making sense out of McLuhan's work. Actually, Neil understood it better than most, among the best of all the people I've ever met. So I was never sure if he really didn't understand Marshall's work or was just sort of enjoying saying that to me. But anyway, I leafed through the manuscript, and it must have been a good day for me because it seemed pretty clear to me what the manuscript was talking about. And I won't bore you with McLuhan's tetrad and Laws of the Media. So I said to Neil, hey, well, this makes sense to me. And Neil said, well, what does it say? So I told him. And Neil said, I tell you what, and I won't do the impersonation on this one because it's too long, but the gist of it is, Neil said to me, why don't you write up a little explanation of what this manuscript says? And I said to Neil, well, why would you want me to do that? And Neil said, well, it'll help us edit the manuscript. Neil, at that point, was editor of the journal, etc., the Journal of the International Society for General Semantics. So those of you who know me know I never turn down any invitation to write. even if there's no money in it, it's so much fun thinking that someone else is going to read what I write. So I went home and I wrote up a little explanation. I dropped it off in Neil's mailbox the next day. And then about a week later, when I went in to see Neil, Neil said to me, I heard from Marshall McLuhan about that manuscript. I said, good. Neil said, I sent up that little explanation that you wrote, and I asked McLuhan if he would feel okay about our publishing your little explanation as a preface to his article in our journal, because, his article makes no sense. So, as egotistical as I am and was, I saw my whole future in communications, disappearing, in a blaze of inglory, because here I was, an upstart graduate student, and Neil had done me the favor of sending up this little description that I wrote to Marshall McLuhan with the suggestion that it be published as an introduction to his, Marshall McLuhan's, article. But on the other hand, as worried as I was, remember I always like being published, so I said, okay, sure, go ahead and do that. Well, a couple of weeks later, McLuhan was in New York, and he asked Neil if we could get together for lunch. That is a lunch with Neil, Marshall, and me. Marshall was quite a character himself. The first thing he said to me is, Paul, you understand really very little of my work, but you're too involved with the logic boys. That, by the way, for Marshall was an insult. He didn't want people to be too logical. But apparently, McLuhan thought that I understood enough of his work that he consented to have that article published in the journal, etc. And looking back, on my scholarly life, that was certainly the most important single thing that happened to me. Because it's extraordinary, for a young scholar to have someone like McLuhan recognize your work, not to mention that Neil had faith enough in my work to create that situation. But that's the kind of person Neil was. I think that, his generosity has affected everyone who was his student or who had anything to do with him. As Tom said and Lance said, I'm so happy that we at least had the time to see Neil in September. As chair of the communications department, I'm constantly getting requests, can I do this, fund that? And so when Lance suggested to me, I think on something like August 28th, Paul, would it be possible to have an event on September 4th at Fordham? My first response was, well, it's a little bit last minute-ish, isn't it? But Lance is the kind of person who always pushes for these things in the face of what more reasonable people would do. And I'm often reminded of, the famous line of George Bernard Shaw, that reasonable people adapt to their surroundings, but all progress in the world depends upon unreasonable people. So I think Marshall McLuhan was unreasonable. I think Lance was unreasonable. Neil was unreasonable. And because of that, all of these wonderful things have happened. So thank you very much for coming here. I'm sure Neil would have been very happy to see all of you.